I've always been drawn to places that others would rather avoid. My name's David Whitlock, and you could say I have a bit of an obsession with the abandoned. You know, those places that time forgot, where the walls whisper stories of a past no one dares to remember. So, when my friends and I heard about this old asylum on the outskirts of town, we couldn't resist. It was the kind of place that just calls to you, with its broken windows and eerie silence, almost begging to be explored. We'd heard all the rumors of coarse ghost stories, strange noises, that sort of thing, but none of us really believed it. Not until we stepped inside. The moment we crossed that threshold, it felt like we'd entered another world. The air was thick with dust and something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every step echoed through the empty halls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. But we were too excited, too caught up in the thrill of the unknown to turn back. We moved deeper into the building, past peeling wallpaper and rusted metal, until we found ourselves in a long hallway. I remember thinking how strange it was that the light seemed to fade the further we went, swallowed by the darkness. As we wandered, we talked about the history of the place, how it had been shut down decades ago, after some scandal. No one really knew the details, but it was enough to keep people away. Well, most people anyway. We'd all brought our cameras hoping to capture something creepy to share with our followers. I had no idea then just how much more than that we were going to get. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something, but the hallways were always empty. Just shadows moving in the corners of my vision, gone as soon as I tried to focus. Then we found it. A room at the end of the hall that was different from the rest. The door was ajar, just enough to see the flicker of light inside. We hesitated, glancing at each other. There was something off about this room, something that sent a chill down my spine. But curiosity got the better of us. We pushed the door open and stepped inside, and that's when we saw them, the drawings. They covered every inch of the walls, from floor to ceiling, hundreds of them. Faces twisted in fear, bodies contorted in pain. Some of them looked almost real, like the eyes were following us around the room. I tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just some prank, maybe an old art project or something. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. There was something about those drawings that felt alive, like they were trying to tell us something. My friend Sarah pointed out one in particular, a portrait of a woman with empty eyes, her mouth open in a silent scream. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked at it, as if I could almost hear her. We should have left right then, but I couldn't resist. I had to capture it. I pulled out my camera and took a few shots, not knowing that with every click, we were sealing our fate. As we turned to leave, I felt that prickling sensation again, stronger this time, like 1,000 eyes were on us. I tried to brush it off, but something kept pulling my gaze back to those drawings. It was like they were watching us, waiting. I didn't say anything to the others, didn't want to spook them, but I could see it in their faces too. They felt it. We decided to keep moving, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was colder, heavier, like the building itself was closing in on us. And in that moment, a small part of me wished we'd never come here at all. But you know, there was still that thrill, that sense of adventure. We pushed on, hoping to find more to explore, but I couldn't shake that feeling. It was like the asylum was alive, breathing around us, watching our every move. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't quite explain, something that made my skin crawl. And as we walked away from that room, I couldn't help but glance back one last time, feeling like we were leaving a part of ourselves behind. Little did I know we were. I don't know why we kept going after that, but something about that asylum pulled us deeper in. Maybe it was the thrill, or maybe we were just too stubborn to admit we were scared. But as we ventured further into the building, the air grew colder, almost biting. It was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment we left that room. The walls seemed to close in around us, the narrow hallways twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. We felt like rats in a maze, but we were too curious to stop. That's when we stumbled upon another door, slightly ajar, like it was waiting for us. We pushed the door open and immediately felt the chill intensify. This room was different, darker, colder, and somehow more alive. Our flashlights flickered, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. Then we saw them, the drawings. Hundreds of them, covering every inch of the walls. They were rough sketches and finished, but there was something disturbingly real about them. Some were of faces twisted in horror, others of bodies contorted in pain, and still others of shadows lurking in the background, almost blending with the darkness. It was like each drawing had a story of its own, a nightmare frozen in time. My friend Mark leaned in closer to examine one of the drawings. "These are really messed up," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. He pointed to one drawing in particular, a figure with eyes hollow and blank, staring straight ahead as if seeing something that wasn't there. I couldn't look away. There was a detail to it, a depth that seemed impossible. It was like staring into a void, a darkness that pulled at your soul. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I knew, deep down, that we shouldn't be there. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't. As we moved around the room, the drawings seemed to shift and change. Or maybe it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. But the longer we stared, the more alive they seemed. I swear I could see the eyes move, following us, watching our every step. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat. My camera felt heavy in my hands, but I knew I had to document this. I started taking pictures, the flash illuminating the room in stark bursts. Each time the light flickered, the drawings seemed to grow darker, more twisted. And then I saw it. A new drawing, one that hadn't been there before. It was us. Our group, standing in that very room, staring at the walls. The detail was uncanny, the way Sarah's hair fell over her shoulder, the way Mark held his flashlight, even the expression on my face. But there was something else, something that sent a chill through my bones. In the corner of the drawing, almost hidden in the shadows, was a figure. A shadowy figure, tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to burn with a dark light. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew we had to get out of there. I turned to tell the others, but the words caught in my throat. The air was thick, heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. It was like the room was alive, watching us, waiting for something. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but there. It was coming from the walls, from the drawings themselves. A voice, soft and sinister, calling to us. Stay, it seemed to say, stay with me. Panic set in. We had to leave, had to get out of that room, that building, that nightmare. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her towards the door, shouting for Mark and the others to follow. but the door wouldn't budge. It was like the walls had closed in around us, trapping us in that room with those drawings, those eyes that wouldn't stop watching. I could feel the panic rising, my breath coming in short gasps. We pushed against the door, kicked and screamed, but it was no use. We were trapped, and the shadows on the walls seemed to grow darker, closer. My heart was racing as we desperately tried to find a way out. The air felt like it was closing in on us, every breath getting harder to take. We could hear whispers now, soft and indistinct, coming from all directions. It was like the walls themselves were speaking, their words curling around us, making it impossible to think straight. I looked around, trying to keep calm, but I could see the fear in my friends' eyes. They were as scared as I was, maybe even more. I knew we had to stay together, but the tension was pulling us apart. And then Mark spotted something. "Look," he shouted, pointing to the far corner of the room. I turned my flashlight in the direction he was pointing, and that's when I saw it. A new drawing. This one was different. It wasn't just a sketch. It was detailed, almost lifelike. And it was us, not just our faces, but our entire group, standing exactly where we were, in the same clothes, the same positions. And there, in the background, barely visible, was that shadowy figure again. It was watching us, just like the eyes in all those other drawings. But this time, it felt real. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I realized what this meant. Someone or something was in here with us, and it was drawing us, capturing us on these walls. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense. How could this be happening? We needed to get out of there, but every time we tried to move, it felt like we were walking in circles. The halls seemed to twist and turn, leading us back to that same room over and over again. It was like the asylum itself was alive, playing with us, keeping us trapped. Sarah started to panic, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. "We're never getting out of here," she cried, her voice echoing through the empty halls. I tried to calm her down, but I was struggling to keep it together myself. I could feel the fear creeping in, threatening to overwhelm me. But I couldn't let it. I had to stay focused, had to find a way out. I took a deep breath and tried to think. There had to be another exit, another way out. We just needed to keep looking. But every step we took seemed to lead us deeper into the darkness. Then I felt it. A cold breeze, like a breath on the back of my neck. I turned around, and that's when I saw him. A tall, ghostly figure, standing in the shadows. His eyes were hollow, like the ones in the drawings, and he was holding something in his hand, a pencil, or maybe a piece of charcoal. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at us with those empty eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew in that moment that we were in serious trouble. This wasn't just a ghost story. This was real, and we were right in the middle of it. The figure began to move slowly, almost deliberately, as if it was drawing us closer with every step. I wanted to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place, watching as it came closer and closer. I could hear the others shouting, feel them pulling at me, but I couldn't look away. Those eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, they were drawing me in, pulling me into the darkness. I tried to fight it, to break free, but it was no use. I was caught, just like the others. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The figure disappeared, melting back into the shadows, leaving us standing there, breathless and terrified. I didn't know what to do, didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that we needed to get out, needed to escape before it came back. But the asylum wasn't done with us yet. Every turn, every hallway, every door seemed to lead us back to that same room, those same drawings, those same haunting eyes. We were trapped, and there was no way out. Not yet, anyway. We were all on edge, our nerves frayed and our minds racing. It felt like every corner we turned was the same. Every door led us right back to where we started. The asylum was playing tricks on us, bending and shifting, keeping us in this never-ending loop. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes, the creeping realization that we might never leave this place. The walls seemed to close in, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was like the building itself was alive, feeding off our fear, our panic. And then the shadows started to move. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. But then I saw them, dark shapes slipping in and out of the corners of my vision, always just out of sight. I turned my flashlight in every direction, trying to catch them, but they were too quick. Every time I thought I saw one, it vanished, melting back into the darkness. My friends were seeing them too, their eyes darting around the room, their breaths coming in quick, panicked gasps. We were all on high alert, every sense heightened, every sound magnified. Then the whispers turned into voices, faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. They were coming from everywhere, from the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Soft and sinister, like someone was standing right behind you, whispering in your ear. I could make out words now, but they didn't make any sense, a jumble of phrases and fragments, broken sentences that seemed to echo in my mind. Stay with us. Join us. They whispered, their voices low and hypnotic. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but the voices only grew louder, more demanding. And then he appeared, the ghostly figure from before. He stepped out of the shadows, his eyes fixed on us, his hand gripping the charcoal pencil like it was a weapon. He was tall, his face gaunt and hollow, like he hadn't seen sunlight in decades. He didn't speak, just stared at us with those empty eyes, his gaze cold and piercing. I felt a chill run down my spine, a wave of fear washing over me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from him as possible, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by his gaze. He lifted the pencil, and I watched in horror as he began to draw on the walls. His hand moved quickly, frantically, the pencil scratching against the plaster, leaving dark, jagged lines in its wake. It was like he was drawing us, capturing our fear, our desperation. With each stroke, the air grew colder, the room darker. My friends tried to pull me away, but I couldn't look away. I was mesmerized, caught in the act, watching as he drew our fates on the walls. I could feel the energy draining from the room, the warmth seeping away, replaced by a cold, suffocating darkness. I could hear Sarah crying, her voice breaking, but I couldn't focus. All I could see was the ghostly figure, his eyes locked on mine, his hand moving faster and faster. The drawings on the walls seemed to come alive, shifting and changing, their eyes following us, their mouths twisting into silent screams. I felt a tightness in my chest, a pressure building inside me, like I was being pulled into the drawings, into the darkness. I tried to fight it, to pull away, but it was no use. I was caught, just like the others. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figure dropped his pencil, his eyes flickering for a moment, and then he was gone, vanished back into the shadows. The room was still silent, the air thick with tension. We were all breathing heavily, our hearts pounding in our chests. I didn't know what had just happened, didn't understand any of it. All I knew was that we needed to get out, needed to escape before it happened again. But as I looked around at the terrified faces of my friends, I realized that might not be possible. Not here. Not in this place. The atmosphere grew heavier, like the walls were pressing in on us. I could feel the weight of the darkness settling into my bones, a cold dread that seeped into every corner of my mind. We were all starting to lose it. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear, while Mark paced back and forth, muttering to himself. The whispers had faded, but the silence that replaced them was even worse. It was the kind of silence that makes you question if you're still alone in your own head. I could feel my thoughts spiraling, and I knew I wasn't the only one. It was hard to keep track of time. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. The asylum seemed to stretch on forever, a maze with no end. Every hallway looked the same. Every door led us back to that room with the drawings. We'd lost all sense of direction, wandering in circles as the shadows played tricks on our minds. I could feel the paranoia creeping in, the fear that maybe, just maybe, we were already dead, trapped in some kind of hell we couldn't escape. But I pushed those thoughts away. I had to stay focused, had to keep us moving. And that's when it started. The walls seemed to close in, the floor shifting beneath our feet. I could hear things, whispers, screams, things I couldn't quite make out. It was like the asylum was alive, breathing around us, feeding on our fear. Mark stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, too afraid to speak. I didn't want to admit it, but I was hearing things too. Voices calling out, faint but persistent. It was like they were coming from the walls themselves, drawing us in. Suddenly, Sarah let out a scream. I spun around, my heart racing, and saw her pointing at the wall. A new drawing had appeared. It was her face twisted in a look of pure terror. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her mouth was open in a silent scream. And then I saw the figure standing behind her, its hand reaching out, its fingers inches from her shoulder. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. The artist wasn't just drawing us, he was trapping us, capturing our fear on the walls. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the drawing, but it was too late. She was shaking, her eyes fixed on the wall. I can't move," she whispered, her voice trembling. I tried to pull her along, but it was like she was rooted to the spot. Mark came over, his face pale. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice urgent. But I could see the fear in his eyes too. We were all starting to crack, the pressure getting to us. And the shadows seemed to be closing in, pressing us closer together, trapping us in their cold embrace. The asylum felt like it was alive, like it was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I could feel it, a presence lurking just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air thick with tension. I tried to stay calm, tried to keep my thoughts together, but it was getting harder and harder. Every step felt like a struggle, every breath a battle. And the whispers were back, faint but there, whispering words I couldn't understand. It was like they were speaking a language I'd never heard before, a language of fear and darkness. We kept moving, kept pushing forward, but it felt like we were getting nowhere. The walls seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness growing thicker with every step. I could feel the fear building inside me, a cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on finding a way out, but it was no use. The asylum had us now, and it wasn't going to let us go. And then I heard it again, a faint whisper, just behind me, so close I could feel its breath on my neck. "Stay," it whispered, and I knew we were in deeper than we could ever have imagined. My mind was unraveling with each passing moment, reality slipping away like sand through my fingers. The asylum seemed to warp around us, the walls bending and twisting, making it impossible to tell where we were. Every hallway looked the same, a dark tunnel leading us further into the depths of this nightmare. Mark and Sarah were close behind me, their breaths ragged and panicked. We tried to stay together, to keep each other grounded, but the fear was pulling us apart. I could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, like a fog that clouded our senses and our sanity. As we moved, I noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls weren't just shadows anymore. They were moving, shifting, almost as if they were alive. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the shadows only grew darker, more defined. It was like they were reaching out to us, their long, thin fingers stretching toward us, beckoning us closer. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead, my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck in place, like the ground itself was holding me back. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared. It was him, the ghostly artist, his eyes hollow and dark, his face twisted in a cruel smile. He held his charcoal pencil like a weapon, his hand moving with a speed and precision that defied logic. He was drawing again, his eyes never leaving us, each stroke of his pencil bringing the shadows closer, making them more real. I could feel the darkness closing in, pressing against me like a weight on my chest. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was frozen, trapped by his gaze. Mark tried to charge at him, shouting something I couldn't make out, but the artist didn't even flinch. He just kept drawing, his movements faster and more frantic, his eyes locked on us with a cold, calculating intensity. And then, just as Mark was about to reach him, he disappeared, vanished into thin air, leaving us standing there, stunned and terrified. I didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go. All I knew was that we were in deep, and there was no way out. Not as long as he was still here. Sarah started to cry, her sobs echoing through the empty halls. I tried to comfort her, to tell her we'd find a way out, but the words felt hollow, empty. I didn't believe them myself. How could I? We were trapped, caught in this twisted game, and every time we thought we'd found a way out, the asylum pulled us back in. I could feel the walls closing in again, the shadows growing darker, thicker, pressing against us like a living thing. I knew we had to keep moving, had to keep fighting, but I didn't know how much longer we could last. And then I saw it. Another drawing on the wall, this one more detailed than the last. It was of Mark, his face twisted in pain, his eyes wide with terror. I could see every line, every detail, like it had been drawn with a surgeon's precision. My stomach turned as I realized what it meant. The artist wasn't just drawing us, he was capturing us, piece by piece, our fear, our pain, our souls. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach, a sick feeling that told me we were running out of time. I knew we had to do something, had to find a way to stop him before it was too late. But what could we do? We were just three people, lost and terrified, caught in a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. The shadows were closing in, the air growing colder, and I could feel the darkness creeping closer, pressing against my skin, my mind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, to think clearly. But the asylum wasn't going to give us that chance. Not now, not ever. I was losing track of reality. Every corner of the asylum seemed to blur into the next, like a never-ending labyrinth designed to drive us mad. The walls seemed to pulse, almost as if they were breathing, tightening with each breath we took. I could see the fear etched on Sarah's face, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. Mark's hands were shaking, his knuckles white from gripping his flashlight too hard. We were all on the edge, teetering between panic and a strange, numb acceptance of our fate. But there was something else now, a new kind of dread that settled over us like a shroud. It wasn't just the drawings or the shadows. It was the feeling that something was hunting us, something unseen but ever present. I could feel it in my bones, a coldness that seemed to seep into my very soul. Every time we turned a corner, I expected to see that ghostly figure, his eyes hollow and cruel, his hand poised with that charcoal pencil, ready to draw us into his twisted world. And then it happened. We turned a corner, and there he was, standing at the end of the hallway, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, my muscles tensing as if preparing to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in his gaze, unable to look away. I could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath, Mark muttering under his breath, but I couldn't focus on anything but those eyes dark, empty, and filled with a malevolent intent. He raised his hand, and I saw the charcoal pencil glint in the faint light. My heart skipped a beat as he started to draw, his hand moving with a fluidity that seemed almost inhuman. The walls around us seemed to shudder with each stroke, the shadows deepening, twisting, and curling around us. I could feel the air grow colder, the darkness closing in, pressing against us like a vice. I knew we had to move, had to get out of there, but it was like my feet were glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. Mark took a step forward, his voice low and trembling. "We have to do something," he said, his eyes never leaving the figure at the end of the hall. But what could we do? We were powerless against this thing, this presence that seemed to control the very fabric of the asylum. I wanted to shout, to scream, to tell Mark to run, but my voice caught in my throat, a strangled sound escaping my lips. The figure continued to draw, his hand moving faster now, more frantically, as if he was racing against time itself. Then, without warning, the walls began to close in on us, the ceiling lowering, the floor rising. It was like the whole building was collapsing in on itself, squeezing us into a tighter and tighter space. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I reached out, grabbing Sarah's hand, holding on to her like a lifeline. We had to stick together, had to stay strong, but it was so hard, so damn hard. The darkness was pressing in, crushing us, and I could feel myself slipping, my grip loosening. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything stopped. The walls halted their advance, the ceiling paused in its descent. For a moment, there was silence, a deep, oppressive silence that seemed to echo through the halls. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, feel the sweat trickling down my back. I didn't know what was happening, didn't understand why it had stopped. All I knew was that we weren't safe, not yet. The figure was still there, still watching, still waiting. And I knew, deep down, that he wasn't done with us. Not by a long shot. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, my mind fraying with every passing second. The silence was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on us from all sides. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. I could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, the uncertainty in Mark's stance, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing: how much longer could we last? The ghostly figure had stopped drawing, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he started again. And when he did, I wasn't sure if we'd make it out alive. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it was no use. The fear had settled deep in my bones, making it impossible to think clearly. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts crashing into each other, none of them making any sense. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. We were trapped, caught in this twisted nightmare with no way out. And the worst part was, I could feel it. The darkness closing in, the walls pressing against us, the air growing colder with every passing second. Mark stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "We can't just stand here," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "We have to do something." I nodded, knowing he was right, but not sure what to do. I could see Sarah trembling, her face pale, her hands clutching her flashlight like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I reached out, squeezing her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, but it felt hollow, meaningless. How could I reassure her when I couldn't even reassure myself? Suddenly, the ghostly figure moved, his hand reaching out, his fingers curling around the air as if trying to grasp something. I felt a chill run down my spine, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, to get away from him, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, feel the sweat dripping down my face. My muscles tensed, ready to spring into action, but my legs wouldn't budge. I was stuck, caught in his gaze, trapped by his presence. Then, without warning, the figure disappeared, fading into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but my mind was spinning, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I looked around, trying to find some semblance of reality, but everything was distorted, twisted. The walls seemed to sway, the floor shifting beneath my feet. I felt like I was floating, disconnected from my own body, as if I was watching everything from outside myself. I heard Mark shout something, his voice cutting through the haze in my mind. I turned to see him pointing at the wall, his eyes wide with horror. Another drawing had appeared, this one even more detailed than the last. It was of Sarah, her face frozen in a look of sheer terror, her eyes wide and unseeing. My stomach turned as I realized what it meant. The artist wasn't just drawing us. He was taking us, one by one, capturing our souls on his canvas of fear. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I knew we had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But how? The asylum was like a living, breathing entity, twisting and turning, keeping us trapped in its grasp. I could feel the walls closing in again, the darkness creeping closer, pressing against my skin, my mind. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but it was no use. The fear was too strong, the panic too overwhelming. And in that moment, I realized we were running out of time. If we didn't find a way out soon, we'd become just another part of this twisted nightmare, another face on the wall, another soul lost to the darkness. I felt the walls pressing in closer with every second, the air growing colder, more suffocating. I could hardly think straight, the asylum playing tricks on my mind, twisting every thought into something darker. Mark was slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow, his face pale. Sarah clung to my side, her grip tight, as if letting go would mean slipping away into the darkness forever. We were all barely holding on, trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end, no escape. The ghostly figure was gone, but I knew he wasn't far. His presence lingered in the air, a cold, heavy feeling that settled deep in my bones. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes empty, but somehow watching our every move. I wanted to scream, to shout at the top of my lungs, to demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't matter. This place was beyond reason, beyond anything we could understand. It had a life of its own, and it was playing with us, toying with our fear, feeding off our despair. I looked around, searching for anything that might give us a clue, a way out. But all I saw were those same endless hallways, the same peeling wallpaper, the same darkness creeping in from every corner. I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me, threatening to pull me under. I tried to push it away, to focus on staying calm, on keeping my friends safe. But every instinct was telling me we were running out of time. The asylum had us now, and it wasn't going to let us go. Sarah was crying softly, her shoulders shaking. I put my arm around her, trying to comfort her, but it felt like a hollow gesture. How could I promise her we'd be okay when I didn't believe it myself? Mark was muttering to himself again, his words a jumble of fear and confusion. I knew he was close to breaking, and I didn't know how to help him. The fear was too strong, too overwhelming. It was like a living thing, pressing in on us, squeezing the hope out of our hearts. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a flicker of shadow, just at the edge of my vision. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I could feel my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I knew we had to move, had to keep going, but my feet felt like they were made of lead. The whispers started up again, louder this time, more insistent. They were coming from all around us, filling the air with a cold, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. Stay. Stay with us. They murmured, their voices low and haunting. I tried to block them out, but it was like they were inside my head, crawling through my thoughts, wrapping around my brain, like a vice. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, caught in a web of fear and darkness that I couldn't escape. I glanced at Sarah and Mark, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. We were all in the same boat, caught in this nightmare together, and I didn't know if we'd ever find our way out. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, pressing in on us from all sides. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the darkness wrapping around me like a shroud. And in that moment, I realized that this place was never going to let us go.